We have one more speaker, last but certainly not least. Sarah McGrew is a researcher with Stanford History Education Group and is based in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. Sarah.
Thanks so much for being here and for sticking around. I know it's getting a little bit late. My name is Sarah McGrew, and like Sam said, I work with the Stanford History Education Group. And because I work in a graduate school of education and I work with a group who all have backgrounds as educators, we take a little bit of a different approach to these questions that we've been talking about tonight, right? And we're focused specifically on thinking about how to teach young people to learn more sophisticated approaches to evaluating information online. But I think a lot of the things that we've learned over the last few years are applicable for all of us, right? That we can all get better at figuring out what's true and what's not when we look for information online. So I'm going to talk about a few things tonight based on research that we've done over the last 3 years. Those are sort of two major efforts. First, we've worked on developing what are now dozens of short assessments of young people's ability to evaluate online information. And then we've also engaged in research about what more skilled people do. So we've specifically looked at professional fact checkers and tried to understand the really specific strategies that they use to efficiently find and verify information online. So I'm going to walk you through sort of what we've learned from both of those efforts together. And just to give some background for what I'm talking about, I want to outline sort of 3 core questions that we've identified that we think people should ask when they evaluate information online. And I think we talk a lot about, right, like just think more critically or think more carefully. But when we think about actually trying to teach students, that kind of advice isn't actually very helpful, right? Just like think harder doesn't work very well with students. So we try to really get specific and break that down. So the first question we always want to ask when we evaluate online information is who's behind the information, right? What person or organization is presenting this? Do I trust that person to present information on this particular topic? And are they an authoritative source? And then we can dive into the topic, right? We can evaluate the evidence that's actually being presented. Again, investigating the source of evidence, and then deciding ultimately whether that evidence directly and sufficiently supports the claims that are being made. And then finally, we should ask, what do other sources say, right? Seeking to verify claims or arguments across multiple sources, ideally multiple sources that come from different perspectives. So I think these questions sort of cover a lot of the ground that different speakers have talked about tonight, but hopefully can start to sort of bring everything together under one umbrella and thinking about what a sort of integrated approach to evaluating online information could look like. But I want to show you a really practical example about what asking and answering these questions looks like online. And I'm going to do that with a task that we've given high school and college students. Piloted this task with hundreds now of students. And in this task, which we do online, so students actually are on the live Twitter feed, we show students this tweet from moveon.org from a few years ago. And it says, new polling shows the NRA is out of touch with gun owners and their own members. Gives a link and then says hashtag NRA fail. And then there's this sort of post below it that says 2 out of 3 gun owners say they would be more likely to vote for a candidate who supported background checks. And we ask students, why might this tweet be a useful source about NRA members' opinions on background checks, and why might it not be a useful source? So this is a complicated post, right? And we ideally want students to consider both the source and evidence presented, and then to sort of weigh what's strong about this source and then what's less strong. And see what they come up with. So what kinds of responses do we get from students? So to the question about why it might be a useful source, the sort of most common responses we get are first students who engage marginally with the source, like the student who says MoveOn has a large following on Twitter, or students that just engage with sort of the content or appearance of the tweet. Like this student who says it could be useful because a graphic with a strong message can be enlightening or more likely thought-provoking. So these students are sort of like dancing around evaluating the content or the source, but not deeply digging into evaluating who's presenting the information or what they're presenting. And then in terms of why it might not be a useful source, the most common response we get by far is about the platform itself. So students write things like, Twitter is a social platform built for sharing opinions, and though there are plenty of news organizations sharing facts on Twitter, I'd be more likely to trust an article than a tweet. So students are writing off Twitter as an entire platform, which I would argue is not very useful, right? We don't want students to write off platforms. We want them to be able to actually evaluate the information that's presented on them. So what would a more sophisticated approach to evaluating that tweet from MoveOn look like? And I want to walk through that using those 3 core questions that I presented. So starting with the question of who's behind information, we want students to prioritize, again, investigating the source of information. But too often we see students passing over that entirely, right? Not asking questions about the source and just digging in to evaluating the content. And I think we all do that, especially if it's content about a topic that we feel really strongly about. It's easy to just kind of pass over the source and engage with the content. But we want students to be able to investigate the source. And we want to teach them to do that in sort of one particular way. And this is through a strategy that we identified, again, in our research with fact checkers. We call it lateral reading. So if we were going to, again, evaluate the source of this tweet, it's moveon.org. But imagine that you're a student and you don't know what moveon.org is. You don't have the sort of things that are coming to a lot of your minds probably when you think about moveon.org. So we would encourage students to investigate the source by reading laterally, by leaving the tweet itself or leaving a website that you're on and actually checking what other sources have to say about it. So in this case, I simply typed moveon.org into a Google search to, again, check what other sources say. And this makes intuitive sense if you think about it, right? If you were trying to decide if a person was trustworthy, you wouldn't walk up to them and just say, hey, are you trustworthy? Right? Because of course they're going to tell you they are. And that's the same thing we're doing when we evaluate websites by staying on the website, right? And trusting what that website says about itself. Right? So a better strategy, one that we saw fact checkers doing, was to leave the site and again see what other sources had to say. And in this case, a site like Wikipedia can tell us pretty quickly, right? MoveOn is an American progressive public policy advocacy group and political action committee. It's in the first paragraph of the Wikipedia page. And your sort of warning lights about Wikipedia might be going off, but again, this is a site that we saw fact checkers rely on as a sort of initial take about an organization's reliability. So once we have a sense of what moveon.org is, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we write the tweet off or decide that we totally trust it, but we're building our sort of stores of information about what MoveOn is and whether this tweet is trustworthy. But next we want to investigate what's the evidence. So again, too often we see students evaluating evidence based on the appearance of evidence. So they might see this graphic below, right, that says 2 out of 3 gun owners say they would be more likely to vote for a candidate. And they say 2 out of 3, that's data. It must be reliable, right? But we want to teach students to dig more into investigating what that evidence actually is and who's presenting it. And in this case, luckily this tweet, provides a link, right, that we could click on. If we did that, it takes us to this article from the Center for American Progress, which says in its headline, gun owners overwhelmingly support background checks, see NRA is out of touch, new poll finds. So just from that headline alone, we can start to see some alignment between the article and the tweet. Right? The tweet's not reporting a fact that is totally disconnected from the article that it links to. So that's a good first check. And if we wanted to spend a little bit more time, we could dig into, again, investigating what the Center for American Progress is and investigating this public policy polling group that actually did the survey that both this article and the tweet are reporting on. So by doing that, right, but at least we know that it's based on an actual survey that was done by a public policy polling organization, and that it found that gun owners overwhelmingly support background checks. So we have that sort of level of verification. And the final thing we want to do is ask what do other sources say, to actually go outside the tweet again, and this time search for the content, and see if we can verify that in other places. So if I just do a simple Google search for whether gun owners support background checks, I get a list of sources. The thing we see students doing, and a lot of research confirms this, is sort of blindly clicking on the first search result, and Dan talked about this, right? But that can get really problematic, particularly if students assume, as many do, that that top search result is the most reliable, because it's often not, right? I would argue that, and we saw fact checkers doing this, that if you spend just a few more seconds on search results and spend a little bit more time reading down the page, you can make a more informed decision about where to click first. And we can do that in a couple of ways. So the first is reading URLs, right? There's a lot to learn about actually reading that green text, seeing what source is providing the information. In this case, the first result is from Huffington Post. And if we have some source knowledge, we can start to make some inferences about what the Huffington Post might have to say about gun control and background checks. And we can also read the snippets, right, which provide some information about what the source is going to say. So we can start to determine, again, if we did click into that website, is it likely to provide information that's relevant to my search? So in this case, again, if my goal is to sort of verify the information that was in that moveon.org tweet, I can read down the URLs and the snippets and start to see Huffington Post, Giffords Law Center, which is again sort of a gun control legal organization, the Center for American Progress, and then I get to the Washington Post and Pew. And again, if my goal, I already have a source from a liberal advocacy group from MoveOn. So if my goal is to find sort of a more central or authoritative source, I might click on the Washington Post or Pew Research Center, both of which I recognize to be the sort of more authoritative organizations. So in this case, just reading down a few more of the search results, engaging a little bit of time reading, might result in a better click for where to actually go for information to verify. So again, I realize that we're not going to engage in this kind of verification that I just walked through, asking who's behind, what's the evidence, and what do other sources say, and investing time in investigating all those things with every tweet we see or every Facebook post we see, right? We would all go crazy. But I would argue that sort of developing those questions as habits of mind, and particularly asking ourselves those questions, who's behind this information? What's the evidence? What do other sources say? Can I confirm this story in other places? That asking those questions before we share a story or before we use something to influence our views or to guide an action that we might take, the more informed we can be and the more informed our communities can be. And with that, I will stop. I will say those assessments that I talked about are on our website, sheg.stanford.edu, if you have children or want to try them out for yourselves. They're a lot of fun, and they're organized by those 3 core questions that I introduced today. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Sarah McGrew, how can we make sure our children, who are such avid consumers of the internet and its content, have critical thinking skills available to evaluate things like misinformation? And as a little addition to that, to what extent is this a part of curriculum as you know it in public schools?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the sort of first step in the work that we've been trying to do for the last few years is to bust myths that I think still exist out there, that young people are, for some reason, smarter and better at evaluating information than the rest of us, right? That because they've grown up with digital devices and because they can, you know, like text and tweet really quickly, that somehow that means that they're more able to evaluate the information that they're finding. And that's just not, it's patently untrue. And we've known it's untrue for a long time, but it's still really easy, I think, to engage with those myths. So I think that's the first thing, is being really clear that young people need our help and need our support. And I think the question of curriculum is a huge one, and one that we are spending more and more time thinking about. And the answer is that it hasn't, digital literacy or teaching students to engage with online information hasn't been integrated into the core of the curriculum for a long time. So I think often it's taught in extracurricular classes like fabulous journalism classes, right? Or the school librarian might come in to teach a research class. But particularly in more under-resourced schools, those classes don't exist, or a librarian doesn't even exist. So I would argue that we need to bring these skills into the core of every subject area. I particularly work in history and social studies education, but think about what it looks like to teach history and social studies and engage students with the internet, engage students in doing research on the open internet, right? Not just telling them specific websites that they can and can't go to, and then giving them specific strategies. So another problem with digital literacy education has been that they use these sort of long checklists of answers, sometimes up to 30 questions that we tell kids to ask about websites. And some of them are super problematic questions, like we tell kids that .edu sites are more reliable across the board than .com sites, which, as Dan told us, is just patently, again, untrue. So we need to update our methods, and we need to bring digital literacy, again, into the sort of core of the curriculum.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
watching MCTV, Millbrae Community Television.